Imagine waking up one morning and pouring a cup of coffee. But instead of turning on your wake-up TV show, the news is flooded by images of U.S. troops stationed on the Canadian border. Sounds ridiculous, right? Well, this was almost a reality with detailed plans under the code name War Plan Red. With President Donald Trump hinting at turning Canada into the 51st state, this reality might be closer than you think. Today, we look at what happens if the U.S. invades Canada and takes the country by force. As crazy as such an invasion sounds, both Canada and the United States already have plans to invade each other. These date back to the period between World War I and II. Surprisingly, Canada was actually the first to put in place plans to invade the United States. As the First World War came to an end, Canada realized that its southern neighbor is more than just a threat. The United States has the power to make a big difference. They have advanced technology, a strong economy, and millions of people to enlist. This was considered a threat. Canada put forward a former war hero by the name of Buster Brown, who would do reconnaissance along the U.S. border, where he found that invading the United States was a lot easier than they thought. What Brown reported back can be summed up in this one quote: "If Americans are not actually lazy, they have a very deliberate way of working and apparently believe in frequent rests and gossip." In essence, Brown found that Americans were lazy, making them an easy target for whomever wanted to invade. So, Canada devised a plan, but it would not be easy, and they would need the support of friends across the Atlantic to make this possible. On the other hand, the United States were carefully devising a plan of their own, and by 1930, it was known as War Plan Red. But we'll get to that in a second. Please make sure that you are subscribed to our channel for your daily military report. Well, looking at the 5,500-mile border between the United States and Canada reveals quite a bit of information. Not only is it the longest border in the world, but it covers nearly all northern U.S. states. A natural plan would be to station troops along the southern border, especially the Washington state area, while moving down from Alaska to create a pincer movement. But harsh terrains and extreme Canadian winters will devastate troops and machinery. This meant that the U.S. chose to abandon this two-pronged assault, rather leaning on a new three-pronged assault that would become known as War Plan Red. But what is this new plan? According to experts, the first move the United States will make will be to send a naval armament from Boston to Halifax. Since Canada will need to rely on support from its allies in Europe, this will create a blockade, ensuring that no one can enter Canadian water. The move toward Halifax is very crucial in this war, especially with the United States aiming for encirclement. The plan continues by suggesting that troops stationed in Albany would slowly begin their march up to Montreal, where they would clear the path for supply lines to be set. However, Toronto in the south remains a massive obstacle. To eliminate this, the U.S. suggests sending another contingency of troops to move on to Toronto. If the plan works, it creates a clear supply line running from Buffalo all the way to Toronto, as the next logical move will be to take Quebec. According to War Plan Red, troops stationed in Vermont and Maine will begin crossing over to Quebec, where they will be joined by fighters moving up from Toronto. This will essentially capture three of major capitals in the country, rendering the Canadian East Coast as taken. But what happens in the West? Well, the United States has a few bases in Montana and Washington State. War Plan Red suggests that troops from Birmingham will slowly march on Vancouver, where they will aim to take the western part of the country. Meanwhile, various contingencies of troops will make up the forces moving through the middle. This plan sounds rather easy, right? Well, it was designed in 1930, and back then, no one truly understood how military technology would evolve and what the 20th century will actually look like. Now, we have fighter jets that can wipe out cities and tanks that can single-handedly defeat battalions of troops. This means that War Plan Red, as it is known, might not necessarily be very effective in the modern era, and it has never been enacted yet. The question is whether this will work in the 21st century. Since the 1930 plan, a lot has changed in the world. Yes, new forms of technology are available, but diplomatic ties have created what we call modern geopolitics. In a war between the US and Canada, geopolitics need to be accounted for. The buzzword, well, that is NATO, or the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. It consists of Europe, Canada, the United Kingdom, and the United States. NATO was established following the Second World War, forcing these nations into alliances that would protect one another should another major conflict break out. This means that it will be absolutely pivotal in the 21st century. A move on Canada today will look very different from the basics entailed in War Plan Red. In fact, the United States is likely to start with President Donald Trump's latest keyword tariffs. Tariffs will generally start with trade, specifically Canadian energy and food products. For example, the US imports lumber from Canada, but a tariff on this would significantly harm Canadian income. If this doesn't work, President Trump could slowly ramp up pressure by targeting financial installations, perhaps even the international SWIFT system. But for the purpose of this video, let's assume that Canada doesn't buckle under the pressure and resist punitive measures. By now, the world has taken sides. With the US either withdrawing or being kicked out of NATO, it means that Europe will shift its support toward the Great White North. As the EU and Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney enter negotiations on how to proceed with a retaliation, the United States will have already begun moving some of its troops and military equipment to the Canadian border. This is where the real trouble begins for Canada. In terms of pure manpower, the United States has around 125 million people who are fit for military service. This is almost 10 times more than the 13.5 million Canada can send to the front line. 1.32 million troops make up the current US active military, whereas Canada has just over 68,000 troops currently serving. Moreover, 13,000 US aircraft are available for use, compared to Canada's 351. But the biggest difference is in tanks. The US has 4,640 tanks, compared to only 74 up north. But further discrepancies are found in armored vehicles. President Trump can use any of his 392,000 vehicles, and in comparison, Prime Minister Carney has around 21,704. These numbers significantly tilt the battle toward the United States, but Canada has another trick up its sleeve, and that is NATO. Should this happen after the current situation in Ukraine, NATO will be able to match the US troop for troop, but sending it all will render Europe vulnerable. However, enough can be sent to turn this into a war of attrition, basek, with the main goal of tiring out the US taxpayer, who will naturally need to fund this ongoing conflict. Another problem the US will run into is the terrain and the extreme cold in the winter, which was the reason for its first failed invasion of Canada. Back in 1775, under the leadership of President George Washington, the United States first attempted to take Canada. Washington ordered troops to take over Quebec, but without any advanced technology, horses were used. Those who didn't have a horse, well, they had to physically march across more than 400 miles of frontier land in unforgiving conditions. The United States quickly took Montreal, but marching deeper into Quebec proved a massive problem. As the freezing winter set in, many troops simply deserted, with the rest succumbing to the elements. By the time they reached Quebec, the British were already waiting, quickly overpowering them and sending the army back to the United States. A few years later, the British were still ruling over Canada, sparking a second attack on Canadian territory in 1812. Again, the combination of British power and the elements quickly fizzled out any attacks, leaving the United States with no other choice but to retreat. Many experts agree that this was the day Canada earned its right to sovereignty, and that any future war or invasion of the country would be completely uncalled for and unjust. Unfortunately, This doesn't seem to bother Donald Trump, with the 47th President of the United States firmly believing Canada should be the 51st state. Since the beginning of his campaign in 2024, President Trump was already focused on Canada. On many occasions, he blasted the country for relying on the U.S. for security and various other economic support. Trump went on to say that Canada is already acting like a U.S. state, sealing his antagonistic stance by calling former Prime Minister Trudeau governor. Trump further unleashed a barrage of tariffs in Canada, claiming that the country is largely responsible for illegal migrants. A claim that is not unfounded, as recent data does provide evidence of many Asian immigrants choosing Canada as their point of entry. Canada responded, with Trudeau first calling Trump's move dumb, and then levying its tariffs on $30 billion worth of American goods. This largely targets the manufacturing sector, and combined with EU tariffs, it might seriously harm the U.S. economy. Moreover, this creates a lot of tension with its northern neighbors, and if a move is made, it will heavily depend on economic sanctions like these. The United States will need to leverage its allies in Europe. But what happens if you have also antagonized these partners? This essentially means that any move on Canada will be only the United States, and it could lead to further ramifications from the EU. As mentioned earlier, Canada forms part of the larger NATO group, which has a clause in the form of Article 5. In layman's terms, this clause means that, should one NATO country be attacked, other countries part of the treaty are forced to intervene and show their support to the defending country. In essence, the United States will be completely isolated, and with its current stance on Mexico, we won't bet that Mexico will act any kinder. In terms of politics, the United States might even end up like Germany, completely alone and having to fend for itself. It will be almost impossible to bounce back from this, leading to perhaps another major collapse like the former Roman Empire. But let's say Europe doesn't intervene, and the United States manages to take Canada by force. Its citizens will be assimilated into the U.S., but being the 51st state, Canada will be part of the government, meaning it needs senators and representatives. It is here where things become a little tricky for President Trump to navigate. Experts estimate that annexing Canada could significantly hurt the Republicans running for the coveted title of President of the United States of America. So, let's say Canada eventually waves the white flag, and the United States absorbs it as the 51st state. How would this affect domestic policy? According to Politico, Canada is mostly Democrat-oriented, which means that it will naturally become a blue state. Due to its size, Canada will also need a large contingent of House seats and representation in the Senate. Given the size of Canada, it is suggested that it will get about 45 electoral college votes. This is just one fewer than California based on its population. States like Florida and perhaps even Texas will have to forfeit about 2 each, with various other states all giving up 1 vote to the new state. This is based on the Electoral College remaining at 538 and the winner needing 270 to win the general election. By analyzing the recent history of United States voting, it will essentially allow the Democrats to start with 253 electoral votes already in the bag. The Republicans will have 202 votes, with 85 votes up for grabs in battleground states. It immediately puts Trump and his party at a disadvantage heading into the 2028 U.S. election. Moreover, the Democrats would only need 17 votes to seal the victory, which will be rather easy if they can snag Pennsylvania or even Michigan. Essentially, a move on Canada could do more harm to Donald Trump's own agenda than it would for the Democrats, who are actively trying to fight against this. One positive is that the U.S. will have access to a plethora of Canadian natural resources. The addition of oil and natural gas will certainly enrich the U.S., and with almost full control over the North American continent, Canada becomes a strong strategic advantage. In fact, nowhere in history has a country alone owned an entire continent, aside from Australia. But the barren landscape of the land down under doesn't help it when it comes to creating a powerful economy. Ultimately, a move on Canada would have far greater ramifications for the world than anyone would ever expect. For starters, the EU will have to split its priorities between self-defense, supporting Ukraine, and now focusing on Canada. This means that resources in Europe will wear thin, and at the end of the day, it will benefit none other than Russia and China. As Europe wanes and the Americas are drawn into another war, Russia will swiftly move to pressure Ukraine into surrendering. China would likely make its move on Taiwan, while focusing on building its economy. Unfortunately, no one will be able to stop them with the big players preoccupied with one another. In the Middle East, lawlessness might run supreme as a major power vacuum is left. Both Saudi Arabia and Iran will quickly try to fill this gap, possibly leading to another escalation in tensions. Moreover, the global oil markets will explode, creating exorbitant levels of inflation and further impoverishing those who are already struggling. Such a war would take years to resolve, and once the destruction is done, it will be costly to rebuild both the US and Canada. Meanwhile, Europe will slowly turn toward the east for assistance, with the United States no longer the flag bearer of the biggest or strongest economy in the world. Regardless of how anyone feels about such a move, the losers at the end of the day will be everyone, with the East slowly becoming the new world's standard bearer. Finally, it is worth exploring how interlinked the world is and why any form of war, especially between big nations, will lead to utter devastation. Nowadays, economies are intertwined, with trade being the center of survival. Should the South China be blocked, for example, it will significantly threaten Japanese trade. Moreover, the U.S. presence along the Suez and Panama Canal will greatly reduce the number of ships that pass through. Naturally, trade all over the world will die down, forcing countries into revolt and possibly even coups. Countries in Africa will bear the brunt of this. Its already impoverished economies rely heavily on Western aid. Just look at how the U.S. stoppage of aid has already affected some of these smaller nations. The world as we know it will come to a complete standstill, and the life you know will cease to exist. As the United States continues making enemies, it is doubtful that anything of a military nation would take place with its northern neighbor. President Trump will resort to economic pressure, but should this fail, the whole house of cards might come tumbling down. But what do you think? Make sure to let us know in the comments below and subscribe to our channel for your daily military report.